Maurice Merleau-Ponty was born on March 14th, 1908, died in 1961, was a French phenomenologist, philosopher who was deeply influenced by Edmund Husserl, as well as engaging directly with many figures in psychology and physiology and in the sciences of the human body. He was also very strongly influenced by Henri Bergson, who engaged similarly with psychology and physiology and the sciences of the body, and as well as Martin Heidegger and Jean-Paul Sartre, although he's critical of essentially all of these four people, least of all Husserl, although he does clearly indicate in the preface to his Phenomenology of Perception that he is going to be going further than Husserl, that he's going to go in his own direction and not be stuck in some of the structures and ideas and ways of formulating the questions and problems of phenomenology that are found within Husserl. So he wants to reframe phenomenology, and he points to Husserl as already telling us that phenomenology was going to have to do this. He says for Husserl, especially in his later works and in the unpublished works, he emphasizes that phenomenology is a perpetual beginning. We are starting over again. We are beginners as phenomenologists, and we are starting over again based on what we have learned from phenomenology. And basically, Merleau-Ponty wants to get rid of the residue of intellectualism and Kantian philosophy. And while Husserl did push back against these things in a major way, Merleau-Ponty just wants to take it one step further. And he goes for the body and for perception. He wants to take more seriously the reality of our body and wants to say that the main currents in philosophy, in European philosophy, have neglected the body and not understood it. They have either been materialistic, and so they've turned the body into a mechanism, or they're too idealistic and they don't pay attention to the subtlety of the body and the body's relation to thought and thinking and consciousness and all of these things. For Merleau-Ponty, the body is absolutely central. It is where meaning emerges. It is where consciousness emerges. And he uses one's own body and the lived body. These are the ways he talks about the body not as an object out there in the world, an inert thing that is pushed around by the causality, mechanistic causality of the rest of the universe, but the body that we live. Another big influence on him is Jacob von Uexküll and the idea of an Umwelt. This is also picked up by Heidegger and Sartre. And this Umwelt is the surrounding world. This is another way of talking about the life world, which was a major theme in Husserl, and which Merleau-Ponty wants to say is what keeps phenomenology attached to the concrete, and it keeps it engaged in the world, even though part of the phenomenological method is to suspend our engagement with the world, right? So the main idea of phenomenology, its main lesson, is the importance of the life world from Merleau-Ponty. Everything that is made sense of through our embeddedness in the world and in relation to others, what I'm understanding here is our dependency on others, and as well as our engagement with them and with the world, and our efforts to bring about something in the future, our anticipations and ways of gearing into the world and into the time of the world, which is to gather up the past and be oriented towards the future. And the life world, from Husserl to Heidegger and Sartre, is understood as being with as a hyphenated word, being with others, that there's something about our engagement with each other and our shared world that is prior to all thinking, all systematizing, all philosophical understanding. It is our engagement in the life world, our being in the world. And there isn't just a life world, or the life world extends beyond what I've just described. There is also a sort of habit world, which is all of the gestural and value-laden movements that we have with our bodies. The lived experience of our body is that we are organizing our movements in certain ways to get around in the world, that we have gestures and facial expressions and things of that nature that have a certain meaning within certain human contexts, interacting with other people. There's all of this world that we interpret and understand and move around in with our bodies based on the formation of habits. And related to this from Merleau-Ponty is the aesthetic world. And not all of our habits are aesthetic and have a sort of expression and style. So the aesthetic world is not separate from the life world and our habit world, but is its own realm of expression where certain feelings can come about, right? So there is as well a kinetic world, the world of our bodily movement, our motricity. But within that world, there is grace, right? Intelligent, embodied intelligence, intelligent movement, expressive movements, and style. So these are overlapping worlds, but we can look at each of them in a unique way as a way in which we are geared into the world, a way in which the world makes sense to us. So these distinctions are there just in phenomenological description, but in our concrete experience, they are the same life world, the life world considered in habits, aesthetically, or kinetically. So another major influence on Merleau-Ponty is Gestalt psychology. And as we saw already with Husserl, one of the essential structures of our consciousness, and especially our consciousness of the world, is the figure-background relationship. The fact that when we are focusing on something, we are pushing into the background what we are not focused on, but also that background is contextualizing the figure. It's what's making sense of it. And there's another term here that is helpful that comes from Heidegger, which is the referential totality, which he uses to understand the context in which something appears. So a tool, a hammer or a screwdriver or something, will appear as relevant and as referential to other beings in the world, right? Nails and screws and wood and the things you put together in carpentry. There's a certain whole in which anything meaningful shows up, and it's the sort of things that we associate with this object and with the way that it appears in a given context because of our way of becoming habituated to the world, because our way of making sense of the world and the way of relating things to each other within the world. Henri Bergson would call this a plane of consciousness, a degree of tension and concentration. We are bringing certain things into our consciousness. We are making them on standby in our consciousness in order to understand what's not on standby, what is actively being considered before us. So if I'm thinking about street signs and in the context of driving, all of what is relevant to driving is kind of brought into tension, even if I'm not explicitly representing all of this to myself. Everything that is relevant will show up as relevant to that plane of consciousness, that referential totality, that structuring of meaning within a certain context. And Heidegger calls this the care structure, that basically instead of the background intentional act and then noema structure found in Husserl, we have a background which can be anything from habits to the horizons of our exposure to the world, what we would call experience or something, as well as desires, our knowledge, and our skills. All of that is creating a background in which an act of caring makes sense. It draws on that background in its understanding of what its caring is for. Why is it caring? Why is it concerned in a certain way? All of this is structured by our background and oriented towards some worldly thing or some future anticipation. So this care structure is the structure of all consciousness, we could say. And Merleau-Ponty kind of gathers up these ideas from Gestalt psychology, from uh, Husserl, Heidegger, Sartre, and Uexküll, and attempts to go through the lived experience of our body from basically every possible angle and engage with contemporary scholars of his time in order to draw out the importance and the insights possible when we take a phenomenological approach. Now, when I was outlining this lecture, I was thinking to myself, I should really be able to say what is perception. That's a bare minimum of what I ought to be able to express to you, right? His book is The Phenomenology of Perception. So what is perception for Merleau-Ponty? And this is in some ways not a difficult question to give an answer to, but at the same time, it is one of those extremely complex questions that can be answered from a multiplicity of perspectives. Merleau-Ponty spends this entire book, 450 pages, trying to say what perception is. I'm going to try to synthesize some of that for you. It will necessarily also be somewhat incomplete, because for it to fully make sense, we have to understand all of the steps that he makes. We have to actually read the descriptions and test them for ourselves and verify them within our own experience. So here is just a taste of what perception is. And my first thought when I thought of this was, well, perception, I think, is expression. But that is not helpful because expression is this thing that we can only understand once we've gone through all of Merleau-Ponty's, almost his entire corpus. It's such a profound idea, and he reworks it throughout his career, even into his late works. But ultimately, perception and expression are going to be two sides of the same coin, and we're not going to really understand what perception is unless we see it as an expression, as expressive. And expression, just very briefly, is related to meaning, the emergence of meaning within the body, and the ability to bring together all prior expressions and draw on all prior expressions while going beyond them and doing something new and expressing in a novel way a meaning that has not been expressed before, but which stands out from a background of prior expressions. Okay, so we'll get to that throughout the course. It's a core idea of Merleau-Ponty, but let's say, what is perception in a bit more concrete way? Well, first of all, perception is habituation. It is our lived body in its habituated state from the sedimentation of our past, also its embeddedness in a certain context. Our body's habits are formed and adapted to the context in which we have grown up and in which we live. So some key ideas here, I already mentioned sedimentation. This is a really important idea for Merleau-Ponty, along with institution and norms. And he's using each of these terms in sort of specialized philosophical senses within this context, but also adapting some of the metaphorical content of them from concrete experience. So our habits are sedimented in the sense of layers being piled up on top of each other through history, through time. Certain habits are the bedrock, we could say, for other habits to be laid on top of them. And so our habitual being in the world, our habit body, our lived body as habituated, is also a sedimented body. There are certain piling up of different habits. And a habit is an institution in the sense that it is put into place, and you institute a law, or you form an institution, or you institute a norm. And so the other big idea is norm. We can think of norm in a very dynamic sense, and that's what Merleau-Ponty does and calls us to do. On the one hand, we have the idea of a soap bubble. The soap bubble undulates and stretches and is elastic, but it is also tending towards a sphere, right? At least if it's in a state of rest. And so the surface tension can hold as long as that norm is abided by, as long as it doesn't fluctuate too much, right? If you blow on the bubble, you can pop it. We can think of norms operating similarly within our motricity, within our motor perspectival perceptive system of movements and actions within the world. If I'm going to walk through the door, I need to walk towards it, avoid something in the room, turn the doorknob, pull the door. If I don't do those things within a certain range of, if I don't reach where the doorknob is, I'm not going to grab it. If I don't pull the door at the right angle, it's not going to open. So there are also norms of a certain sort that structure and shape our body's movement within the world. We're going to talk a lot more about habituation, but all of our perceptions are gravitating towards certain norms. If we walk into a museum and we look at a painting, at first we're going to see it far away. We're going to be drawn towards seeing it closer. And in that, there is something like a norm, but as Merleau-Ponty will show, within the aesthetic experience, there's a plurality of norms, and none of them can be, the perfect perspective on all of the possibilities within a piece of art. So what is a perception? It is a habituation, as I've just said, but it is also a gestalt. I mentioned gestalt psychology already. It is a moment within a larger whole. That's what a gestalt means. The figure is a part of the whole, which is the figure and background. And this embeds the perception within our larger whole, the entire universe, as well as our whole past, all of our memories, and the cultural, historical memory that we are part of. And it operates non-mechanistically. It's not a representation produced by an external stimuli or something like that. And we'll see that in more detail in the first chapter of the book. So perception is a gestalt, and one which arises through habit, but it is also a plurality of multiplicities, right? We have multiple senses, and each sense is open to a multiplicity of sensible qualities and details. But this plurality is organized by our disabilities and our abilities. It is this organization of our body, its relation to itself as a multiplicity, right? Multiple limbs, different sense organs. It is synergizing these. It is a synthesis or a synesthesia of the body. And Merleau-Ponty will look at things like how sight is completed by touch and a tactile sensation. And so it is the interweaving of our sensations within our body that gives us a coherent experience through our senses. And our embodied sense-making, which pulls together this multiplicity, is also interwoven with things like gestural expressiveness of the body, our sexual being, and our social interactive bodies. So it is not understood through one single sense-making schema. It is multiple sense-making schemas working simultaneously and overlapping. But our perception is also partial and perspectival. But the partial and perspectival do not mean that it isn't inexhaustible. And this is a key idea for Merleau-Ponty. So in the same way that Husserl said there are profiles, every perspective we have speaks to us of the possibility of changing that perspective. Well, it is in this that the perspectival and the partial are inexhaustible. We can modulate, we can gestalt shift. And when we change our perspective, we have a global reconfiguring of our sense making, which I'm calling modulation. This is a term from Merleau-Ponty, which basically recontextualizes things. So our perspective on things can be dynamically shifted, not simply changing the content of the experience, but changing the global gestalt and the context that it understands. And in that sense, Every perception is complexly contextual. As I said, when we see a painting in a museum, we carry our past with us and we embody various social and societal significations, whether these are abilities and privileges or the deprivation thereof. It is the way in which we bring with us a whole structure of meanings, and all of this informs our perceptions, informs the way we feel ourselves to embody the situation and the space. And when you stand in front of the painting for 10 minutes, you will continuously modulate this background, right? We will have different recollections, we will see different images from different angles, and we will even drift off into thought somewhere else and then arrive back at this perception of the painting anew and with new thoughts and memories primed in our minds and in a new way of feeling our body's position within the space. Another way to think about modulation of our attitude is to think about the way that this works with our visible perception of depth. There are all these examples in Gestalt psychology. There's the duck rabbit, or there's this image of stairs, and we can see it either as going up or down and kind of changing orientations. We can look at a two-dimensional drawing of a 3D cube, and we can either see it as a mosaic of flat tiles, or we can see it as having depth, as being a cube. So depth is going to show us a way in which our perceptions can modulate, a way in which we can bring together a coherence of a certain perception. There are also cases that Merleau-Ponty will look at where patients are given special glasses with mirrors, and they basically flip the visual field upside down. And other examples of using mirrors to disorient one's perception and then to see how the body adapts. And in these cases, let's start with the glasses that flips the visual field upside down. At first, this person is bumbling around. It's so disorienting. But if they persist wearing them for 2 or 3 days, eventually they can re-coordinate themselves to this image, this upside down image, and it feels normal again. And then when they take the glasses off, they have to adjust again back to normal perception. There's another example of seeing oneself move in a mirror that's set at 45 degrees. And at first, when you move with respect to this mirror, your sense of up and down is totally disoriented and the person stumbles around, but eventually they are able to adjust and readapt themselves to this new norm of perception. And what Merleau-Ponty shows here is that our experience of depth and our sense of spatiality within the world is a lived signification that opens a certain horizon in a certain way with a certain norm, a certain polarity. And these can shift, just as the duck rabbit shifts, just as the stairs can pop out differently. And each one of these gestalt shifts, each one of these context shifts, changes the perception. And lastly, I should say that perception is always historical, is always embedded in our historicity and in our relation to others. It's historical, it's economic, and it's sexual. And these significations, this meaning that our perceptions are shaped by, is paradoxically both endogenous as well as embedded and interrelational. So we are shaped in our perceptions through these forces of historical, economic, and sexual meaning. And this isn't just projected onto us artificially from outside. It is shaped by our relation to others, but it also has an endogenous, it's born within our own lived body. And that encompasses consciousness, our memories, as well as our bodily movements and processes and feelings. And this gets us to another major issue that Merleau-Ponty discusses in the preface, which is the idea of the ego and the relation to others. The big idea is that Our relation to others is a pre-personal structuring of our meaning. It is also a pre-phenomenological, pre-reflective fact of our meaning. It's always already there structuring the way that we have meaning. So when phenomenologists like Husserl come to this question, they are partially drawing on our immediate meaningful structures, although they are unnoticed prior to the phenomenological reflection. We're also encountering a whole system of concepts based on Western philosophy and metaphysics, where the other is either an identical consciousness to me, and so there's actually no problem of others. The other is just another consciousness connected in some kind of ideal space of consciousnesses coexisting. Or the other is utterly inaccessible because of the mediation of matter. Our bodies interact with each other within the plane of matter, but our consciousnesses have no connection to each other. But this is somewhat of an artificial problem. The inaccessibility of other people's minds and experience is a bad way of stating the problem. And in our pre-personal meaning making, in being in the world, in our life world, and in relation to others, we are not inaccessible to each other, and we cohabitate certain meanings and experiences. There's a sort of unthematized affirmation of all of our sensing that we are sensing a world shared with others, and that we are viewing others, and that others are viewing us, that I am visible, and that I am there for others to see me, that I have an exteriority. So he's taking issue with the cogito, which is to reduce experience to a thinking and a thought of itself, and wants to push these ideas of intentionality found in Husserl and then Merleau-Ponty's own ideas of expression and put them back into the body and see the body as the site from which they emerge. And here's what he says in the preface. The cogito has, until our present day, devalued the perception of others. It has taught me that the I is only accessible to itself, since it has defined me through the thought that I have of myself, which I am clearly alone in having, at least in this ultimate sense. In order for the word other not to be meaningless, my existence must never reduce itself to the consciousness that I have of existing. It must, in fact, encompass the consciousness that one might have of it, and so also encompass my embodiment in a nature and at least the possibility of a historical situation. The cogito must find me in a situation, and it is on this condition alone that the transcendental subjectivity will, as Husserl said, be an intersubjectivity. As a mediating ego, I can of course distinguish the world and things from myself, since I clearly do not exist in the manner of things. I must even separate myself from my body insofar as it is understood as a thing among other things, or a sum of physico-chemical processes. But even if the cogito, thinking, that I thus discover has no place in either objective time or objective space, it is not without a place in the phenomenological world. I rediscover the world, which I had distinguished from myself as a sum of things or of processes tied together through causal relations, in myself, as the permanent horizon of all my cogitationes, thoughts, and as a dimension in relation to which I never cease to situate myself. The true cogito does not define the existence of the subject through the thought that the subject has of existing, does not convert the certainty of the world into a certainty of the thought about the world, and finally does not replace the world itself with the signification world. Rather, it recognizes my thought as an inalienable fact, and it eliminates all forms of idealism by revealing me as being in the world. So Merleau-Ponty wants to affirm the reality of ideas, the inalienable fact of thought, but also our being in the world, which refutes all interpretations of thought as residing in idealism, in a consciousness that is beyond time and space. Instead of a Cartesian cogito existing in separation from the world, we have a engaged and embedded act of perceiving and being conscious and embedded in a perspective and modulating and gestalt shifting consciousness that is always oriented towards the world. And in phenomenology, what we are doing is loosening the threads of this attachment and engagement of our consciousness and embodiment and embodied intentionality within the world in order to see them anew and understand them and see how the meaning comes to be in our experience of the world and in our embodiment.